So the boyfriend or relationship tactic is the most common recruitment method in sex trafficking in the United States today. Can you please explain this tactic to someone who has no idea what it is?
So the boyfriend, or you'll hear, a Romeo trafficker, a Romeo pimp, what they're really doing is they're using their relationships, building trust with someone, building a relationship with someone to then exploit and traffic them. And this happens so often with younger girls because, it's a little bit, trafficking is one of those things where the vulnerability is what people are looking for. They're looking for a vulnerability to be able to exploit. And I would say, honestly, a lot of the problems that I've seen are there are girls that are coming from really unstable or harmful homes. Some are in foster care. A lot of the girls that we have worked with don't have dads. And so they're missing something, right? They have this vulnerability, a lack of love, care, and compassion. And so actually it sets them up to be a really great target for traffickers because a boyfriend or a Romeo pimp really is just trying to get somebody to fall in love with him. So it's very easy to give gifts and say nice things and take him to a meal and build a relationship. That girl, unknowing, then ends up getting exploited. And we see this so often. The conversations that I've had with survivors of trafficking in the beginning will say things like your trafficker or your pimp. And that girl will literally correct us to say, oh, that's my boyfriend or my fiance. And so it's a mental, it literally is a disconnect. That girl thinks that person loves her and is caring for her and is providing for her. Many times it's the only person who is actually doing that. And so it's almost easy for them to convince and then flip it around to exploit that young girl. And so a lot of what I say in classrooms or, to parents, people are concerned about trafficking. And to me, I'm like, actually, these tactics, when you uncover them through prevention education with teenagers, it's so powerful, right? Like if I'm a trafficker and my tactic is to come and kidnap you, that's really hard to prevent kidnapping. Like if somebody really wants to get to you, that's a pretty complex and difficult thing to prevent against. But if they're using a tactic like a Romeo romance type of situation, it's easier to have conversations with our students about how that's happening. Hey, be asking questions if they're buying you, crazy expensive gifts and doing all of these things for you, if they're a lot older than you are, if they're asking for inappropriate images, being able to start conversations around the tactics of trafficking actually is super powerful. And it gives me a lot of hope because it feels much more preventable when we're able to unveil these common lures and tactics that traffickers use, like romance or, a Romeo relationship.
Put simply, human trafficking is modern day slavery. Most people think that slavery doesn't exist today, but in fact it does, in the form of exploitation using force, fraud, or coercion.
Human trafficking, like the legal definition, involves force, fraud, or coercion of a person in exchange for something of commercial value. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be monetary, an exchange of money, but it can be for drugs, for security, for shelter. It encompasses, of course, sex trafficking, organ harvesting, debt bondage, labor trafficking, and is prevalent across the entire globe, not just here in the United States, but in every country. It's essentially, in a simple term, modern day slavery.
I tend to liken it to the exploitation of vulnerability would probably be the best way to do it. Whatever that vulnerability may look at, the means to do so will depend upon the one who's attempting to be victimized. And so So say, for example, you're a young woman who's wondering, do I look pretty? Or you just had a fight with your friends or your mom and dad or something like that, and you're feeling kind of on the outs, or and somebody trolling the internet, and you happen to put that out on the internet. Somebody trolling the internet is looking for somebody like you. And so might comment on the fact that you're very beautiful, or that they understand that they feel the same way about having that fight with their friends or their parents, or something along this. Or maybe you're an aspiring singer or a star or model, or or somebody from another country who just wants to improve their situation, and you've got somebody who is saying, I can help you with that, or I can help you move along with that, or I think you're great, and here's a way that I can help you. And so again, that vulnerability potentially, I mean, you wouldn't think it'd be a vulnerability, but it's a vulnerability, it's that need or that desire that somebody uses for their purposes in order to then profit in some way for themselves.
It doesn't happen here to understand that this happens anywhere. This happens in gated communities, whether it's Atlanta, Georgia, or it's some county in Virginia. This happens, and it's right in front of our eyes.
When a lot of people think about human trafficking, they think about something happening in other countries, in developing nations. They don't realize that it's something that's happening here in the United States.
Human trafficking isn't an international issue. It's literally everywhere, and it's happening in places big and small. And so I would say that's probably the most common myth that we run into, is that it's a foreign issue, that it's not happening in the US, and people certainly don't think that it's happening in their community. I think sometimes we tend to come up with who we think is the perfect potential victim for trafficking. And a lot of times people don't realize that in the US, that domestically, like, most victims are born in the US that are trafficked in the US. And there's a misconception that these are always people that are being brought into our country to be trafficked.
I think one of the biggest and most common myths that I encounter is just the way in which trafficking happens and what it looks like. I feel like I spend most of my time debunking the movie Taken, that it is a stranger preying on a young girl in a foreign country, or that it's a creepy guy in a white van, luring victims in the parking lot, which of course can and does happen. But when it comes to human trafficking, that's not typically what it looks like. In fact, we know that 90% of victims of human sex trafficking know and have an existing relationship with their victim before the trafficking even begins. And so I think debunking that myth is really important, because if you don't know how it happens or what it looks like, you're not going to be able to address it appropriately. And so more than it is a stranger that's snatching a young girl off the street, it's a family member, it's a boyfriend, whether that's a pre-existing boyfriend or a trafficker that plays the long game and poses as a boyfriend and builds a genuine romantic relationship. And then also it happens online. And so it's not necessarily going to be off the street or in a parking lot, but just through interactions on social media platforms, on video game platforms, and different online avenues.
Many people think that you have to have movement across the border in order for human trafficking to exist, but that's actually called human smuggling. And they're two separate legal definitions there.
I think another myth is that people that are being trafficked, people are under this impression that they have either brought it upon themselves or it's something they want to do. Like, they confuse sex trafficking for sex work, or they think that the person, like, if they've been using drugs, they think it's because they want to. And it's like, no, this person has been pushed, coerced into doing these things to survive.
One of the first ones that come to my mind is that that people who are participating in this are doing it because they want to. So that would probably be more related to sex trafficking, but we could even tend out to labor trafficking. That's somebody coming here, on say some sort of a visa, that they're coming here on a work visa or something, and then all of a sudden because of the contract was like really iffy, they find themselves being exploited and working tons of hours and not being paid overtime or some glitch in the contract. So you'd say, well, they signed it, they knew they signed the contract, but with a person who is, being sold for sex out there, and people are thinking that that's the reality. They want to do it because there's money involved, right? But the fact of the matter is, in both of those situations, when somebody who's been trafficked or is presently being trafficked is somehow been able to be surveyed both internationally and in our own country, in the United States, 90+% of those people are not doing it because they want to. So people have to understand that they're not in those situations. They're not, and if there is a way out, that they would, take it. And so, and for my survivor friends who are coming out of the sex trafficking industry, they would say that the percentage is far higher, that the number of people who are voluntarily doing it is really in the 3-4% area. And so you've got 96% of those people who are not doing it, but somebody has coerced them, threatening either themselves or their family. They've used physical force. They've addicted them to some sort of a narcotics so that they could control them through that addiction. Any myriad of things that they may have, fraud may have been initially, the idea that this person loves them and continues to use that love to exploit them and sell them and stuff like that. Because if you really love me, do you do this? I mean, how could you say you love me when you won't go out and sell your body to these people so that we can get toward our dream, whatever that dream may be? And that's usually based on something that the survivor, the person being victimized, wanted. So that's one huge one.
Safe harbor laws.
Safe harbor.
Safe harbor.
Non-criminalization laws of minors.
To non-criminalization of juveniles.
Safe harbor.
Some states have these safe harbor laws that would prevent child victims from being charged. And in fact, it would make sure that they are regarded as victims of crime. Right now, Virginia allows for child victims of trafficking to be charged and prosecuted as criminals.
To the best of your knowledge, can you please explain what safe harbor laws are? Or another term would be non-criminalization laws for minors, while also explaining Virginia's current position in relation to those types of laws?
Certainly tried, and it has changed because not only has the majority control in Virginia changed parties, but particularly the former majority party courts committee was heavily represented by heavy representation by prosecutors, and prosecutors were not at all comfortable with purging someone's record, even if the person was a minor, even if you had a court ruling that that person was in a human traffic situation, I could not get the bill passed to purge that person's record, which of course hurts them forever in being able to have a productive life. We are moving to make those changes appropriately, as particularly as I've just outlined, but actually what we are doing is broader than that, not just limiting it to minors.
It makes sense to me. Like I said earlier, you can't jail yourself out of this stuff with the drug situation, and this is another one here. You can't jail yourself out of it. If we're jailing people for protection because of their service, and we should provide some service for that, no question about it.
And I think it's very important that we help to rehabilitate people to a point as whole as possible after they have gone through such a traumatizing experience. And many times they are very, very young when they find themselves in those situations.
Specifically, we're not criminalizing minors because there's no such thing as a child prostitute. And so there's no reason for anyone under the age of 18 to be charged with prostitution.
So what I would say is I would like a bill, no matter what it is, that would increase opportunity, increase choice, increase options for survivors of trafficking towards success.
I think there are a number of ways that Virginia could improve their laws to protect victims of trafficking, and it might not look the way that many people think whenever they think or hear the word human trafficking. For a very long time in our country, we have addressed the issue of human trafficking through a criminal justice response. And while I think that's definitely necessary, I truthfully believe that if we want to really prevent human trafficking from happening, we need to have laws that address the underlying causes of human trafficking, which tend to be those systemic failures. So not having a wide safety net for people who are experiencing homelessness or joblessness, or, you know, come from communities of poverty and don't have access to education and healthcare, and all of these kind of like social determinants of health and life expectancy, right? So making sure that we provide really great safety nets for people to access so that they're not in a position where they're easily vulnerable to exploitation. I would love to see more mandatory training for all of the systems that we know survivors come in contact with when they're being trafficked. So the child welfare system, for example, is one of those agencies, the services that we constantly see our trafficking victims coming out of, or at some point being involved in. And because I think we have so many preconceived ideas as to what a victim looks like and what the perfect victim is, I think so many people, so many children especially, are not identified as being trafficked or at risk of being trafficked. And so they usually age out of the child welfare system and then are left in those vulnerable positions that I was talking about earlier. Law enforcement, same deal. We just need to be able to train law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, everyone involved in pretrial, teachers, emergency personnel, so first responders, all of these people who have the contact with people who are being trafficked really need to be trained to be able to identify and respond when they find somebody who is suspected of being trafficked. And I think a lot of it comes down to this notion of what is a perfect victim, in dispelling some of those myths so that the professionals who are in all of these different industries really have an idea of how trafficking looks in their communities. And so they can step in and intervene whenever they suspect that it might be happening. Also, the industries where we see trafficking happening most frequently, so hotels, motels, training the employees of hotels and motels in the service industry to be able to identify trafficking, I think would really go a long way. There is federal legislation that allows companies and corporations who knowingly benefit from human trafficking to actually be held civilly liable, which I think is huge. And I would love to see more states enact state legislation to allow for that recovery, just because federal legislation is very burdensome and expensive to litigate in court. And so I think a lot of trafficking survivors are less inclined to do so. But if they had a personal injury statute, some form of relief, where they could go after the people with the money, right? Because if you are trafficked, you most likely have you come from a background of poverty, then you potentially have a criminal record, which means if you're able to get out of that situation or get out of the life you are are going to have a hard time finding housing, meaningful employment, getting education, all of these things that really set you up to lift yourself out of poverty. And so whenever we're trying to make a victim whole again, one of the things we really look for is restitution, and not just the criminal restitution, but also allowing survivors to have the civil penalty where they can go after the people with the money, which are the hotels that knowingly looked away whenever they saw, you know, the same person coming and getting a hotel room for an hour every day, every weekend, whatever. So I would love to see more laws like that. Goodness. Post-conviction relief is huge. It is something that I am incredibly passionate about and have worked the last 2 years to try to get passed in Virginia, which thankfully we have passed vacater legislation and affirmative defense legislation, but unfortunately right now there's still not comprehensive. So only those prostitution related offenses and what we in Virginia call the body house offense, which is what I like to say is the police officer didn't have enough evidence to charge them with prostitution, so they're going to charge them with the body house offense. But those are the only two laws or charges in Virginia that you can have vacated from your record as a victim of trafficking. And we know from working with victims, it goes well beyond that. Even if it is a sex trafficking victim, they're forced to commit a whole multitude of crimes. If you don't reach your quota from engaging in sex work, then you're expected to steal money, steal property that you can then sell for money, steal things from Target that you can sell for money. Some of them are forced to steal cars. So there's carjacking, there's drugs. Either you're forced to sell them or many clients are using drugs to suppress the trauma that they suffer. So we see a lot of clients with drug offenses on their records. And then sometimes trafficking victims are forced to recruit and traffic other victims. And so they might even have charges for trafficking. And so obviously the more serious an offense, so if it's a felony offense, the less likely you are to get meaningful employment, education, housing. And when a victim does not have access to those things, they are at a very high risk of being re-victimized and exploited.
But I think we do have quite a bit of opportunity left in Virginia to look at areas of our code and how we address the crime of trafficking and how we address the victim and the survivor of trafficking. Just knowing the long history of criminalizing survivors of trafficking for actions that they were forced into. I think we've made a lot of progress in that space, but we have a lot of work left to do as well. And I intend to continue to work on those issues.
Especially something like this. So my suggestion is find a patron who's going to be around for a while, who gets into this issue in the House and the Senate, and try to make them champions on this. And if you do that, I think you'll be successful.
Victims are not criminals. There are nieces, our nephews, our sons, our daughters. They're our next door neighbor. They're our fellow employee. There's somebody in our circle and world that need our help, not our condemnation. As long as we treat them like criminals instead of victims, we're going to continue to play into the revolving door of these survivors perpetually being victimized. And it's going to ask, is that really what you want? Is that the legacy that we want to leave to the next generation? We were willing to continue to treat them like criminals instead of victims? I hope not.
Human trafficking is very real. It exists in your backyard, and it is easily preventable by providing those, those three things that I talked about previously is the prevention aspect, the response aspect, and then the supportive services. So
Imagine your freedoms being taken from you. Imagine being told when to brush your teeth, how much you can eat, when you can have a drink of water, when you can go to the toilet, when you can take a bath, when you can sleep, how much you can sleep. Telling you what actions you must take. You have to go deal these drugs. And if you can't think about that for yourself, if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if you have family members that are children, if you have neighbors that have children, think about that basic freedom that we, the United States of America, we profess these freedoms, and yet we allow human trafficking to go on. Is this something that you want to continue? This is not a partisan issue. This is not a local, county, state, or federal issue. It's an everybody issue. Whether you choose to engage and be passionate in the game, it's okay if you're not. We've all got something to be passionate about. But if one of you in 10 of your peers who are representing the constituents, me, our team, our victims, those that are brought into our state, you are representing people that are trusting you. And if you want to be trusted, you need to earn that trust by doing what is right for the people instead of getting into all the partisan baloney.
That there needs to be mandatory training for law enforcement and anybody that works in advocacy. That there also needs to be laws to protect these trafficking victims.
Survivors need them, and we need them to listen to survivors. I think doing this work, I've come to learn that oftentimes the victims know what they need best. And I've been so fortunate to work with so many survivors. And a lot of them, once they come out the other end of what's happened to them, they want to advocate. They know what they need. They can tell the legislators what they need. And if legislators can listen to survivors and advocates, I think that we can come up with legislation that will be better for all of our communities and our state as a whole. And I think one other thing I would tell them is that we need to focus on protecting victims and stop punishing them. It's not fair to survive this event, survive trafficking, and be punished for it. That's just not, it's not acceptable. And I don't think any of our current legislators would want to see that happen. I think a lot of them don't even know it's happening. And they need to know they have the power to make that change.
I would say to Virginia state legislators, you are in a position of power. You have been elected to have the opportunity to make a difference to everybody in this state. And so we want you to hear from and represent everybody, including some of those who have experienced some of the worst trauma and victimization that you could ever imagine. And they don't have a voice, they're not heard, they're not seen. And so you have to depend on those of us, nonprofits, different entities and organizations, to fight for them. So we ask that you listen, that you be willing to be educated in this, and that just because you don't see it and you don't understand it, just don't turn a blind eye. This is a very difficult topic, similar to domestic violence. You don't see it all the time. You don't fully understand it if you're not a victim of this issue. And it's not like there are thousands of victims running out in the street saying, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking, just due to the nature of this crime. So when you do have a victim, a survivor who's brave enough to testify, please be assured that they represent so many others. Just because you don't see the many behind them, they recognize thousands of other individuals that you could have an impact in making a difference for them. So take seriously the testimonies that you hear of survivors, because, this is a very rough estimate, but I've heard that out of all of the victims of human trafficking, only about 2% get out and actually go on to live a healthy life. Only 2%. So if you're hearing from 1 or 2 survivors, you've got to believe that they are a small number, but representing a huge crowd.
They will not run to you for help. They will reject your generosity. They will not trust you. They will be scared of you. But they need you. They need you to take action. Take action. Do it. Do it without praise. Do it because you're uncomfortable and because you're angry. And before you do it, listen and do it right.
Educate yourself, make time to learn, make time to understand, put away some of those preconceived notions that you have, as well as fears of how it would work. I think, of course, any law will come with, I think, negative consequences, because there's no perfect law, because there's no perfect people. And so things won't always work exactly the way we want them to, but continuing to put some of those fears aside, move in the right direction. And these are people in our communities that this is happening to, people in our neighborhoods that are being exploited, that are being trafficked. And as a legislator, you represent those people as well. And so we need to represent them fairly and take the time to educate ourselves and to learn from other states and other countries on what does and doesn't work, and be open to new ideas and to try new things, because it's important. And these are your constituents as well. And just because you can't hear their voice doesn't mean they don't have one. And so I think it all comes back to education and taking that time to listen to people who call and who care about this, taking that time to listen to them and learn from them, especially people, in the coalition. We call legislators and we take the time to educate and to share. And so just being open and giving it time.
The reality is traffickers are betting on us, whether it's me as a mom or you as a legislator. They're betting on us not paying attention and shying away from the issue. And so I really am hopeful that we'll come really close to the issue of human trafficking and start thinking of creative ways that we can counteract it in Virginia and really around the country.